Waikato. It's 9:35, 9th of August 2023. Welcome to the Climate Action Committee meeting. I'm just going to, and then we'll get into it. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tua. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. He hia ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, he hei, mauri ora. Thank you. Right. Jump to apologies. I've received an apology for lateness from Mahuta. Otherwise, it looks like everyone is here. Can I get a mover? Thanks, Pamela. Stu Kneebone. Those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. And we'll jump to confirmation of the agenda. That's it be as circulated as business of the meeting, and it might sit longer should we need to, but I think we're looking pretty good with the number of items we've got today. I'll move the agenda. Anyone care to second? Thanks, Mike. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Great. Do we have any disclosures of interest that are further to what we've already got on our register on the council? Right, we're looking good. That's great. Then we'll move on. Then our first item is the Climate Action Roadmap, which has come to us several times for some feedback. We have Lisa Armstrong presenting along with Karen Bennett. Mike. Would you like to open that one, Karen?
Thank you, Chair. Kia ora koutou, welcome, and welcome to members of the public, media, staff. This item is the presentation of our final draft updated Climate Action Roadmap. You'll recall that this was first approved in 2020 by the Council. It's been reviewed and updated just recently to reflect legislative changes, national climate plans, climate science, new GHG emissions inventory for the region, which we will hear next item, and Council's own strategic direction for the 2022-2025 triennium. Council or committee members have had the opportunity to discuss this February, April, and June. And so now we bring it to you for endorsement and recommendation to the Council, subject to minor typographical corrections and perhaps areas of graphical interpretation. And Councillor Dunbar-Smith, I just notice here that we will be updating the graphic about the emissions inventory after we've had the discussion with the team here to reflect the position of forestry, the drawdown there. Next slide. So the update is really of two documents. We have the roadmap itself and also an update of the position statement. And what this is a collection of all of Council's positions on climate change gathered together on one document. And this is so it's easy for our stakeholders and our staff to see Council's position on climate change response in one place. The roadmap provides a stocktake of all of Waikato Regional Council's functions and activities. It clearly states the Waikato situation and the Regional Council's response to our context. It acknowledges that we don't have all the answers, nor do we have all the levers to affect change. So it spells out what we can do, what the Regional Council's contribution is, and how it might partner and collaborate with others to respond to climate change. So just in a nutshell, the Council's climate direction is captured there on the left-hand side. You've got your strategic direction with climate change interwoven through all of your goal areas and outcomes. The climate implications are considered in all reports to Council for decision. Have your roadmap and you've got the position statement. To give effect to it, at governance and implementation, you've got this committee covered through risk management. In the CE KPIs, there are two very important KPIs. One is to actually reduce or to show how we will be net zero through our own operations in transport and flood drainage. And the other, of course, is to enable renewable energy for our region, which is one of the most significant areas of contribution to climate change response. The Climate Action Roadmap Advisory Group is a cross-directorate group of senior staff members to ensure that climate change response is integrated into all our work programs in a consistent fashion. And then, following adoption of the roadmap, we will bring the work plan to you, which then allows us to deliver on our commitments, and we will measure and report against that in a full fashion. So your roadmap, what it is, it's an evidence-based document which integrates climate change responses across all council activities, provides guidance and direction for staff and stakeholders about how we will deliver to the climate challenge. And then also importantly, has been key to guiding investment decisions for the work we're doing as we put together the long-term plan. What it's not is equally as important. It's not regulatory or a policy document, but it informs those documents over time. And it is not financially binding, but it does inform your budgets. So your roadmap pathways, the 9, they're there. You can see them in the papers you've got. They cover those key areas where we can make a difference as a council. Some are internal, and some are done with others. For the implementation, as mentioned, we've got our staff group, the Climate Action Roadmap Advisory Group, and the work plan coming back to you over time and to be reported against. And final slide, please. And this shows you some of the activities, projects, and programs already underway or still to be advanced. We have the Regional Climate Change Risk Assessment, which informs adaptation discussions. Now, this will be discussed as the last item on today's agenda. We're well into the Regional Plan Review Programme with the freshwater policy, coastal management. We have spatial plan readiness, which you've been discussing as part of the next long-term plan, getting ready for spatial planning across our region. And the spatial plan will be absolutely integral to how we respond to climate change. Procurement is an important lever for effecting change through how we spend our money, how we direct our investments. The corporate emissions reduction plan is focused internally, how we reduce our emissions in our activities as we go about the business of running a council. And then sharing knowledge and ensuring that people can have all the latest information and tools to enable them to make informed decisions, provide good advice and guidance to councillors internally, but also we can share this externally. And there are many forums with both at council level, but also with our stakeholders about climate change response. The key pathways you've been discussing, the water security strategy, the absolute importance of biodiversity to both our well-being, but also climate change response. The Regional Resilience Programme, fundamental to our region's ongoing success. The Sustainable Infrastructure Decision-Making Framework, something that will be coming through in this long-term plan. Peat soils and carbon monitoring, and we have the team here who can certainly answer any questions you have when we get to the GHG inventory discussion. Healthy waters, freshwater management, obviously that water security is linked to that, but sufficient water for healthy ecosystems. And there's discussion in the roadmap about the increasing drought risk over time in this region. Energy and then public transport, our fastest growing emission source and one of our greatest opportunities for reducing emissions, but also ensuring that the well-being of our community so that people have access to services, to education, to health, for example. So an important service there. So on that, I will just pause and invite comment from councillors.
Thanks, Karen. And a thank you to all the councillors who have put some effort into reviewing this multiple times. Some of them are not in the room. Some have attended just out of interest every now and then with the workshops and the committee. And ultimately, feedback I got last training and when the first one came out was really positive from external stakeholders, and I can see how this one has, through what we've learned from the starting of the local climate change risk assessment, has a lot more information in it about the impacts that we're likely to see, which I think will be really useful for others as they prepare their scenario planning and their own reactions to what's in there or what others are proposing. There was a bit of a concern last time when we were passing this around what this document means, and so I want to thank you, Karen, for just really defining that clearly. It doesn't set policy. It is not financially binding. It pulls together all of the things that we are doing. So while there are lots of actions in there, a lot of them are already underway, are already funded from previous budgets, and the actions that are in there for the future will come back to us as councillors to ask what we want to do over multiple reports over the next few years anyway. It's just showing us the direction. So if there are the actions in there are showing and guiding staff that there are things we want to investigate and look at. So I'm keen to hear from the committee if there are further thoughts on the document or whether you are thinking that this is making sense and landed in about the right place. Sure. Yep. Go for it.
So firstly, just a question. Oh, is that working? Yeah. Just a question. Page 26. We've got a
Of the agenda.
Yeah, emissions in the Waikato region, and there's that quick facts thing on the right.
Yep.
When we say 91% of sequestration is from exotic and 9% from native, I'm assuming the 9% native is post 1990 established native.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I get that. I'm just wondering about the picture that's painting. Do we need to add a bit more clarification? Because to me, it's sending quite a negative message as to the role of native forestry in terms of sequestration, because we know that native forestry is sequestering a whole bunch more than that. But obviously, we're bound by the way in which we're trying to achieve in terms of post 1990. And I just wonder if expand on that a little bit to not try and
give context,
fudge anything, but just to provide a bit of clarity around the context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, acknowledgement.
Because it's kind of sending a message, hey, let's forget it. Truckloads more points.
And I wonder if we bring this up for further discussion when the team and Sarah Saylor join us in the next item, further clarification, because she has done 3 inventories now for us and will have a really good understanding.
Yeah, okay. I just had a couple of really minor potential amendments or typos as well. So page 20, the next page down, but on agriculture, it's recently estimated that we've got 3,051 dairy herds. I thought we were at 4.5, but just might check that one. So I've seen the 4.5 figure recently in other different parts of the organisation. And the only other little one was page 57. So how climate change, it's their energy and industry one. And below the picture, how climate change impacts this pathway. And the third paragraph, need to add an average of 400 to 500 megawatts of new generation annually. Should that not be new renewable generation annually?
Ideally, it would be renewable generation, but it was actually about meet the demand.
Yeah, okay. But it says here to meet national GHG emissions reduction targets.
Yeah.
So adding non-renewable is not going to help.
It's not going to help at all. No, that's a given.
Yeah. That was all.
We can put that in. Yeah, thank you.
Pretty minor, but yeah, that was all. Yeah.
Good to bring up these minor things as well, because it is locked in once it's when it's final. I did
Takeaway doubt.
I had a few that I shared with Karen this morning as well, of little ones, and they're all really minor, similar to that. But one larger one I picked up was that on page 73, the strategic direction freight goal was missing, so that the committee knows it's there, because we've already committed to it in the strategic direction. Fine, go for it.
Is that working? Yep.
Yeah, you're good.
A couple of meetings ago, I asked about sea level rise and if we could have an update on sea level rise, because about 10 years ago, we were informed at this council that there was going to be inundation, et cetera, over on the Coromandel and other places. So I wanted 2 meetings ago, I asked for an update. Has that update
It hasn't come
been
yet.
presented yet?
No, you'll be able to come to it still.
When's that happening?
So, apologies, Councillor. We were going to be able to have that discussion with one of our staff members later on, but unfortunately they're unwell today. But there will be an opportunity to have
including
tomorrow, it's important information that we need to include.
and by the way, tomorrow the adaptation workshop that is also a good chance to.
I don't want to talk. I just want the information presented.
We'll bring it in future.
Also, in this presentation here, in the plan draft, page 29 of it, the plan. In the EPC committee the other day, we talked about rainfall and how you've captured the rainfall from 1960 here to say 2020. And we asked, where's the rainfall for the last 3 years? Because we've seen a big increase precipitation, which isn't included in this. So then I go and I say, well, why did we choose 1961 to start capturing this information? Does anyone have an answer for that? Why 1961?
May I invite Mike Scarsbrook, our head of science, led this piece on to you.
Councillor, the analysis that some of our scientists did around the rainfall patterns is based on sort of decade by decade. And so the 1960s is when we started having consistent water rainfall measurement across the region. There are some sites that we've got rainfall going back to, Kura goes back to the early 1900s, but 1960s is rainfall measures across the region. And that particular figure is looking at the pattern in decadal rainfall patterns, because of course individual years can be very, very dry or very, very wet, and we account for that in that long-term trend.
Are you presenting an update on rainfall just as an opportunity to look at what the last 3 years have done?
We could certainly present a figure which shows, but
I think
course
the
it wouldn't be at a
we asked for that.
It wouldn't be at a decadal scale because we haven't got a whole decade.
I struggle with such an important planning document to be based on information that's only 60, we're talking climate, and it's a long period of time. Climate should be considered. So that's a short window that we're sort of basing all this on, and not knowing what the sea level rise issues are as well. So I'm just a bit worried that there's inadequate information and data being used to form this. Okay, thanks. Oh, and the other thing was what Stu pointed out that I was going to cover as well, but thank you.
Right, thanks, Clyde. Anyone else? Want feedback, or are you just happy to vote?
Oh, just one other thing, sorry.
Oh, yeah, we'll sneak in Clyde first.
Just can you give us an indication of cost, up to date, what this has cost, and being non-statutory, if it was axed, what would save with the plan?
We have had it externally peer reviewed at, over time, about $28,000, Lisa.
Okay.
Done by staff.
Just a brief comment on page 75, and this is the section looking specifically at 8 and talking about working with the adjoining regional councils to support interregional connections. I think this is really imperative when we look at the connection of Waikato Regional into Auckland Council, also into Bay of Plenty, and ensuring that our transport network robust and resilient and are able to move our growing population as well as our commercial goods. And so just wanting to expand on our call around rail in particular, because I note that we specifically say passenger rail. I think we need to expand our conversations beyond passenger rail and include the effective and efficient movement of freight, both between Auckland and the Waikato, but also Waikato Bay of Plenty, and ensuring that those conversations are happening around dual tracking between Hamilton and Auckland, as well as electrification of that line to support our emissions reduction direction.
Thanks for that, Pamela. Really good point. And so since the freight strategic goal was missed out, accordingly also it doesn't come through enough in the actions. Karen, did you want anything? Is the committee happy for slight tweak and wording to what Pamela did for any?
Just would allow us to have
'cause
those broader conversations.
Yeah, which we even had the other day at the Public Transport Subcommittee for Future Proof. Yeah, so
we will incorporate that as
Thanks.
a point to make.
Right.
Just curious, Karen, on some of your colleagues' feedback on Clyde's comment that this was non-statutory. I mean, it feels a bit to me like there's way in which we do some of this stuff is not necessarily laid down by statute, but a lot of stuff we do in here is very much, this information is contributing to is very much one of our statutory obligations.
That is true. It's a contributor to a lot of our statutory obligations, as we point out up there in the work program, the freshwater policy, for example. So we have to have regard to the effects of climate as we're developing those programs, those policies, regulatory response. But they go through process, they are extensively consulted upon, and this is just the first part of those conversations.
really useful to pull everything together into one place for people to understanding this topic well. All right, in that case, move to the vote. And Tipper to second. Yep. And then if William, if we could just add the words that be received No, it's number 3, recommendation to council. And at the end there, noting inclusion of, or should we just say discussion?
8.10 captures it, but you want more specificity about inter-regional freight and the rail.
Noting inclusion of inter-regional freight. Rail freight, sorry, rail freight.
And,
yeah.
and got passenger rail there.
And so if you just say the freight, F-R-E-I-G-H, on action 8.10.
Yep.
Comma and minor edits, including images. People happy with that? Did I capture it about? All right, in that case, we had Stu move, Tipper second. All those in favour, please say aye. Sorry, this is for both of them. If you'd like them to be separate, we can separate if the mover and second are happy. So then we'll vote on the first one, number 1, that the report is received. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Then we'll mover and seconder for item 2. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Yep. Do you want that recorded, Clyde? Yep. No, it's fine just to make a note. Right. Thanks for that. Then we can move on to the next item.
They're online.
We've got next item, which is the Waikato Regional Greenhouse Gas Inventory from 2021 to 2022. I've got Hayden Jones, Team Leader Soil and Land, Alice Wheatley Wilson, Scientist Soil and Land, and Sarah Saylor Stanku, and Ross Abercrombie. Barristrat, joining online. Right, who would like to present first? Open up this item.
So through you, Chair, councillors, Alice and Hayden have led this work for the 3rd regional GHG inventory, working with Envirostrat, and I'm not sure if Sarah Saylor's online yet, but Sarah Saylor has been at the forefront of 3 of these regional inventories, so she has great familiarity with our region and has noticed the trends over time and has some recommendations to share with us. But until Sarah Saylor joins us, I wonder if we hand over to you, Alice or Hayden.
Wonderful, thanks, Karen. So Hayden and I are here to present the results of the Waikato Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory for the
Alice,
20.
Can I just get you to pull it a bit closer?
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah,
cool.
Thanks.
So yes, Hayden and I are here to present the results of the Waikato Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory for the 2021-22 year. We're also going to touch on the 2 case studies about organic soils in the freshwater management unit. And we're going to touch on some of our recommendations as well. Next slide, please. So just a brief introduction to the team. So while WRC had managed the contract and had project oversight, this work is contracted out to Envirostrat, as with the previous 2 inventories. And Chair Saylor and Ross did the inventory prep and reporting, and both of them are online. Next slide, please. So just a bit of background to put the regional inventory into perspective. So I won't delve into the first 2 points, but basically international obligations and national frameworks trickle down to us at the regional level, and it's our responsibility as the regional council to have strategies for climate change, and accounting for emissions contributes to this overall response, as well as helps with our other climate change work within council. So the purpose of this inventory is to estimate, understand and identify where emissions are coming from and assess these changes over time. So this inventory report offers regional and district level emissions breakdown, and this helps us with tracking progress in emissions reductions and engaging with key sectors. So given that this is the third regional inventory, we can now assess changes and trends over time. Next slide, please. So the methodology used in this inventory is the GPC, and this follows the guidelines of the IPCC 2006. And in the absence of local tier 2 emission factors, we use default emission factors from these guidelines. We also follow the climate change 5th synthesis report. The sectors that we measure emissions for include stationary energy, transport, waste, IPPU, agriculture and forestry, and these fall either within scope 1, 2 or 3. So scope 1 being emissions within the region, scope 2 being emissions related to grid supplied energy, and scope 3 emissions being outside of the region but driven by emissions within the region or activities within the region. So the inventory measures 7 different greenhouse gases, and the inventory boundary is the territorial boundaries of the districts within the region. The Waikato region is predominantly an ag-based economy. It's a transportation corridor and a distribution hub. It has significant energy use and electricity assets, including hydro dams, various geothermal assets, and the Huntly Power Station. We also have 2 airports, one in Hamilton and one in Taupō. Next slide, please. So let's delve into some results. So firstly, this is just a high-level emission summary and a visual comparison of the sectors in the bar graph. So obviously agriculture dominates, as with the 2 previous inventories. This is followed by transport and energy. Forestry also has an important contribution, although offsets are down since the last inventory. This is why our net emissions are comparatively higher this year. But we'll delve into each sector in the next slides. Next slide, please. So firstly, agriculture. Total ag emissions were 8.1 megatons of CO2 equivalents. This represents 67% of gross emissions. And this year we sourced data from the 2022 Ag Production Stats Census, which was released in 2023 this year. So ag emissions are broadly split into 2 categories, emissions from livestock and emissions from aggregate sources. The highest emitting category within this sector is enteric fermentation, and methane is the dominant greenhouse gas. This is followed by manure from grazing animals within the aggregate sources emissions. And we've just had a few differences between the previous inventory. So we've seen some reductions in animal numbers, namely dairy, which is down 8%, and sheep, which is down 12%. But this is partially countered by the increase in beef, which is up 18%. And alongside animal reductions, we've had fertilizer reductions as well. Next slide, please. So stationary energy emissions are from electricity consumed by residential, industrial and commercial users and generated by non-renewable sources and the consumption of coal, gas and biodiesel. The total emissions equated to 1.5 megatons of CO2 equivalents, and this represents 13% of our gross emissions, making this our 3rd highest sector. And the highest emitting categories within this sector include natural gas, followed by electricity and fugitive emissions from coal mining. Next slide, please. For forestry, total forestry emissions led to a net sequestration of 1.7 megatons of CO2 equivalents. This offsets about 14% of total emissions. So forestry activities are basically a balance of carbon sequestered into growing trees versus carbon lost through harvests. And in the table on the right there, you'll see that most of this is sequestered by exotic forests, 91%, while native forest sequesters 9%. So this year we sourced data from the NZ Forest Growers Levy Trust, and previously we've sourced this from Stats NZ. And you may have noticed there's quite a significant difference from the previous inventory, which offset 44%. And this change is largely due to the high harvest volumes this time around. But it's worth noting that harvest is cyclical, and that in a few years, perhaps we're going to see some sort of rebalance when we see more replanting and less harvest. Next slide, please. Industry processes and product use, or IPPU, includes emissions from refrigerants, foam blowing, fire extinguishers, aerosols and MDI, and sulfur hexafluoride. These are estimated using the National Inventory CRF tables, and these equated to 1% of gross emissions. And this is due to the phasing out of refrigerants and persistent fluorocarbons. And you'll see that refrigerants are the highest emitting category within this sector at 93%. Next slide, please. So in terms of transport emissions, these include emissions from on and off-road petrol and diesel fuel sold within the region, as well as biodiesel, rail, bus and aviation fuel. Total emissions equate to 1.9 megatons of CO2 equivalents, which represents 16% of our gross emissions, making this our second highest emitter. And on-road fuel makes up 86% of that category. Next slide, please. So waste makes up 2.7% of our total emissions, and solid waste dominates this at 89%, while wastewater processing makes up 11%. In terms of sourcing this data, solid waste was estimated using historic waste volumes per person per year, while wastewater was estimated using top-down methods. So since the last inventory, we've had a 12% increase in waste, and this is largely due to population increase and the inclusion of Tirahia and Bay of Plenty landfills. Also seen a slight decrease in wastewater due to management improvements. Next slide, please. So overall, we've seen some modest changes within each sector. We've seen a 3% decrease in gross emissions since the baseline inventory in 2015-2016, and a 5% decrease in gross emissions since the previous inventory. And the three sectors with the greatest changes are agriculture, which we can see there's an obvious downward trend, and this is based largely on animal number reductions, particularly for dairy and sheep. Transport, we can see that's an increasing but fluctuating trend between years. And forestry, this is our largest change. And this is largely due to increased harvest volumes, significantly reducing the overall offsetting potential of the forestry sector. And this explains why we have much higher net emissions this year. Next slide, please. So onto the case studies. So in the Waikato region, we have 65,000 hectares of drained organic soils. This is mostly under pastoral agriculture. However, drainage and disturbance of organic soils leads to lots of greenhouse gas emissions. However, these aren't accounted for in the regional inventory currently. So this time around, we decided to include a supplementary report to identify methods, calculations, considerations, and recommendations on how to calculate organic soils emissions at the regional scale. So while the national inventory uses the 2006 IPCC methodology, we've decided to use the updated 2013 wetland supplement and, where appropriate, local Tier 2 emission factors. So using this final recommended method, total organic soils equated to 1.5 megatons of CO2 equivalents. And the dominant category for this was grassland, and the dominant greenhouse gas was carbon dioxide. So this is quite a significant number. If we put that into context, transport was 1.9 megatons of CO2 equivalents. So going forward with this, we'd recommend adding organic soils into the next regional inventory. And in terms of where this is at the moment, the report is currently under peer review. Next slide, please. So the Hauraki, or the draft Hauraki FMU, is a geographic area containing Kapuatai Peak Dome, Waiho and Piako rivers, which are important freshwater systems that interact with the Hauraki Gulf in the Firth. Predominant land use in this area is dairy on low-lying drained organic soils and sheep and beef on hill country. So the FMU case study models greenhouse gas related land use options that could mitigate climate change effects such as sea level rise and greenhouse gas emissions. However, work is preliminary and intended for internal consideration of sequestration options and greenhouse gas mitigation material potential. So further development should include community and iwi discussions. Next slide, please. So on to some recommendations. So this year we had a few issues around data access. So we recommend enhancements to data access at the district and sector level. Firstly, for stationary energy, we recommend seeking additional data sources for fossil fuel users and biofuel, as biofuel is becoming more important as we see a shift away from fossil fuel-based energy generation. Secondly, transport, we recommend a standardised collection of fuel tax data across TAs, and those TAs with airports collect fuel and flight data in a standardised manner with respect to commercial sensitivities, which was quite a barrier for us this year. For solid waste, we had a similar issue around commercial sensitivities, so similar recommendation, collecting solid waste volumes within the region and anything entering the region as well. In terms of wastewater, I understand enhancements are underway by districts and Water NZ, so we look forward to that data. In terms of agriculture, because we use a national source, the NZ Ag Production Census, this is a national level census apportioned by district. So we ran into some issues with animal numbers being unexpected in urban Hamilton City, so we just recommend further investigation of the effects of downscaling. We recommend enhancements to Scope 3 or cross-boundary waste, and finally we recommend collecting further primary data at the district and regional scale to understand those harvest volumes. Next slide, please. Off the back of the forestry recommendation, we also recommend a regional forestry study on harvest versus planting and sequestration projections at the district scale. We also recommend continuing the automation of emissions calculations and data management. This year we used Power BI, so we recommend using that in future. We also would like to review the timing of data source upgrades. So this year, as we were finalising preliminary data, this was about the same time that the National Inventory and the NZ Ag Production Census came out. So essentially we needed to update our preliminary data immediately. And also review the 3-year interval between inventories. In terms of commercially sensitive data, this is quite a barrier for us, collecting data, particularly for waste and aviation. So we recommend coming to data supply agreements around provision of data from contractors. As of the end of 2023, the Climate Change Commission recommends that we shift from the IPCC 5th assessment to the 6th assessment, and this is going to require us to use the latest IPCC global warming potential values, which may cause changes, and we'll also have to recalculate the previous inventories. And finally, as spoken about in a previous slide, we would like to integrate organic soils into the regional inventory. Slide, please. So in terms of finalising the project, peer review of the regional inventory and organic soils reports are underway. Also want to consider the studies or the case study findings. And finally, have a project debrief and an inventory review just to consider the use and the purpose of this inventory with districts, as we believe the use and purpose may have changed since the first inventory. We just want to understand how this drives data gathering and data granularity. Next slide, please. I just want to acknowledge the following groups for their support, particularly Ross and Chair Saylor for bringing the inventory together. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Alice. And Sarah Saylor and Ross online. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, nothing to add from me.
Good morning, everyone. Nothing to add. If we have any time for questions, we'll be very happy to answer any questions. And thank you, Alice and Hayden, for walking through the results.
Awesome, thank you. I've got a bunch, but we'll let the members go first. Stu Nebone first, and then Ben.
Can you go back a couple of slides? There was one about, you made a comment about agriculture in Hamilton.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that Hamilton City comment and what you mean by downscaling effects. Sorry. Might have missed something you said.
Hold on, I'll just, Alice will get you to leave yours on, and if I could just, I've got the order of Stu, Ben, and then Tipper. No, go for it.
Cool. On, right? Cool. I think Ross or Chair Saylor is best placed to describe downscaling effects, but essentially the background was because we use a national scale source and it's apportioned by district, we found that there was 15,000 cows in Hamilton City, and so this seems a little unusual, but we're not sure of where this has come from or where these animals are sitting. But this was an issue that came up right at the end of the wrap up of the project. So in order to investigate that, we'd need to come up with a bit more of a scope and a budget around this. But I'll maybe pass it on to Ross and Chair Saylor if you want to add anything.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Yeah, Ross here in Kia ora koutou. To members, yeah, on this issue, it is very much, Alice has described it well. This is a national level data set and a strong data set from census, ag census that was undertaken last year. So the data is strong. However, when we come to an urban council, when we have a look at, they place imputations around those that haven't entered a census form. So there's a level of error there. And then there's also, for a small number of farms, they undertake perturbations to keep some confidentiality of the small number of farms. So there's a certain amount of noise built into those. And in the past, there has been a suppression of some lines of data within the town boundary because of a small number of farms as well. So when we look at that, we know that particularly for Hamilton City, and it's the only district within the region that we've seen this, the animal numbers particularly seem elevated from what we would expect, and working alongside Hamilton City, would like to consider that in future. But we certainly stand behind the data at a regional and a wider district scale. So that's the background to that, and it is very much taking a national data set down to a small urban council. Doesn't sort of make sense. So we are looking into how we go about that in the future inventory. Thank you.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks, Ross. And so the rationale with the forestry one, digging further into at the district scale, because I get what they do on the census, but I'm struggling to see what the benefits are for digging into the likes of forestry at a district scale, or is it just systems?
I'll let Ross take this one in as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this year we had a change from data source, Councillor Nebone, and so went from, in the past we've had the ag census data that's collected the forest harvest volumes. This year, Stats NZ has stopped collection of that data point, which is has been a little bit painful for us. So in bouncing around ministries, we then went to the New Zealand Forest Growers Levy Trust. So like other production levies, this is measured on product that's been across weighbridges in the region. So high quality data, but has seen a significant increase in harvest volume at regional scale. And the wood region for this is Central North Island, which includes the Taupo Bay of Plenty forests as well. So that data has been apportioned down to our territorial authorities, and we've used the mature age exotic trees from the National Exotic Forest Distribution. But again, once we do that apportioning, we see that there's some unders and overs at district scale. So the suggestion of a forestry study is to consider where the forestry is occurring, get a finer granularity on that, because it does have significant impact on some districts like Waikato. Again, Hamilton stood out because there's been next to no forest harvest within the city, but the National Exotic Forest Distribution says that there's about 9 to 14 hectares of harvest that has gone on there. So when we look at those scaling effects, we know that this is an area that could be enhanced and does have significant impact on sequestration potential for the region. So there's certainly a material area within the greenhouse gas inventory to consider further.
Okay, now thanks, Ross.
Thank you. Then I'll pass on to Ben.
If we go to the last slide. Steps are one back from that. Maybe it's one on from that. It was simply, it talks there about there was a slide there that said district councils make financial contribution. So I wanted to know what contribution do they make to this? And also, do you have an idea of the additional costs of the organic soil study and the forest?
So WRC funded 50% of the inventory itself and solely the FMU case study and the organic soils case study as well. And as far as TAs, we divvied that up 50% and then divvied it up by population within each district.
But the TAs did pay towards.
Yes, if they were agreeable to it. So not all TAs contributed funds.
And you got an idea of the additional costs for the expansion of the organic soils and the forestry study that you're looking at?
We don't have an idea about the new forestry study as we haven't scoped it out yet. But in terms of the organic soil,
the organic soils case study was undertaken in-house, essentially through staff time as part of our board program relating to peatlands and house gas emissions from those.
So there's capacity to do the forestry one in-house as well? You've got there some recommendations about additional work.
Oh, I think that's something that would consider as part of the post-project review in terms of what will be involved there and the skills and capability required to undertake that.
So, something I wanted to say probably leads on nicely from that, which was I recall 3 years ago we had issues with data also and recommendations for better data. And just in general, the recommendations from this, it would be nice to track it somewhere as to where the next steps go or how far we take any of the recommendations and just track that so that we don't lose sight of it. So I'd just like to propose that in a future meeting of the Climate Action Committee, we'll have a memo come to update us on that kind of thing. Tipper, are you done, Ben?
Yes.
Good, and thank you for the report. Just a couple of questions. It refers in a couple of places to the FMUs and capturing, I guess, more detailed, that is a unit of measurement in the future or improving our data. That is with the Karakia case study. what I'm wondering is, because there's no obvious category, I'm assuming all marine vessels, etc., all those, everything that happens on water is counted in? Because we had quite a big workshop on blue carbon here too. Or is that another phase? Is that phase in the third phase of this?
So I think currently the blue carbon is excluded because it's within the coastal marine area and FMU is just land-based. But perhaps Ross, you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, thanks, Alice.
can-
Go, Teresa.
Perhaps I can jump quickly into this, and that will most likely link to the question observation to data as well, and the fact that we're making recommendations around data improvements. The blue carbon dimension is not yet covered in the inventory, and this is not just a matter of the regional inventory, it's really a matter of national inventory for New Zealand, mainly driven by the fact that in our obligations, we haven't looked at marine ecosystems as potential, if you want, sources of both solution as well as sources of emissions. So this is part of a wider, if you want, policy considerations in terms of where and how blue carbon is going to be considered. It is, however, we know that in terms of resource managers and landowners and those that are interested in ecosystems, including iwi and restoration, there is an interest in this area. How we can bring that into a greenhouse gas emissions inventory is partly what we're trying to explore with the FMU case study. And also the idea with an FMU case studies is also because we know that in reality, lots of decisions now are at the intersection between, climate and greenhouse gas emissions, but also land use and how we manage our waters and so on. So we're trying to think through whether we have the ability, technically speaking, to do emissions inventory based on a special unit beyond administrative units, which has been the driver to date, regional and then districts units. And we know now that it's possible, and we looked at the potential for sequestration. The challenge, though, in relation to blue carbon is that the science is not very advanced. So if we talk about data improvements, for example, for forestry or agriculture, we have way more certainty in relation to the science. When it comes to blue carbon, we don't. And so even for the FMU case study that we prepared, we used sequestration ranges in marine environment that are only sourced from a couple of studies, ad hoc studies in New Zealand. So with respect to a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, there wouldn't necessarily be high quality data that can, if you want, make the threshold for an inventory. However, there is a lot more research happening and there will be a lot more evidence points that can actually support the incorporation of blue carbon as part of a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and obviously also the linkage with opportunity for reduction. Because while we look at the inventory as a way of accounting of how we are doing on the emissions reduction trajectory, it is also this idea of that there are solutions to emissions reduction, and we can work better with nature to do that. And blue carbon, to a large extent, is within that spectrum.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure we hadn't lost that. Kia ora.
Great. And I'm going to move on to Pamela, but before I do that, just a very quick question, which is, and it's kind of related to this, the fact that currently there are only certain things included because we have methods for them, but there are other things in future that might be included. And when we talk about future sequestration options like blue carbon or wetlands, etc., in different ways. Two quick questions. One is aviation already included in this one?
Yes.
Because I'm mindful
Yes.
it's not included in other national ones. Yeah. Okay, that was a yes. And then the other one was, how come now that we have the data for the organic soils, what was the reason for the decision not to include it this time around already? What's the difference to including it next time around?
So we had a meeting with MFE, who runs the national inventory, and it was upon their suggestion that it would be better to be aligned with the national inventory as well, because they're supposed to bring in organic soils within the next few years.
Okay.
So if we were to bring it in at a regional scale, it would tip off international reviewers of the national inventory, and would we want to keep our relationship with the national inventory and MFE.
Thanks.
All good.
Yep, that makes sense. I mean, we have the information. That's the key thing for us, and it's great to hear that it's coming into the national one as well. Pamela, and then
Got it. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just thank you for the report. Just a couple of things. With the solid waste, are we do we take credit for the solid waste that comes from Auckland into our landfills here in the Waikato? Does that is that included in our emissions inventory, or do they keep that for themselves?
I'll let Ross
No.
take that one, or Chair Saylor.
It's Chair Saylor here. The answer is very short. No, in the current inventory, we do not account for emissions as a result of landfilling from outside of the region.
Right, and considering that the largest city in New Zealand contributes to our solid waste and therefore our emissions, I think am I interpreting that
no,
correct?
So what I heard Sarah Saylor say was that it's only the waste from the per capita that's here living in the Waikato.
Okay.
And so,
Oh, sorry, that's not what I just heard, but
do you want
okay.
to
Have I
do you
got
want to
that?
just comment
No.
again, Sarah Saylor?
That's correct. So we are only accounting for the emissions generated as a result of residents within Waikato, not for the waste that is imported for
Fantastic.
processing.
Didn't want that, that. Exactly. Thank you,
All right,
Councilmember.
then.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, this is, if I can just add, this is actually an aspect that we're hoping to, in the future, we recommended further considerations because of the approach through GPC to emissions accounting. In principle, we should be accounting for the waste that is being sent for processing, for landfilling in Waikato as well. But we haven't done it to date, which we just reflected the population numbers.
Yeah, and I'm mindful that there's a way of doing things by consumption and by production. So in the climate action roadmap, there was the planetary boundaries picture, and you could see each of the categories was you can account in both ways. That's yeah. If we want to, we could do it either way we wanted.
I suppose it would be interesting
Correct.
to assure that Auckland in their emissions inventory is including what they are. We wouldn't want it just disappearing somewhere.
Not at all.
So thank you for that. I suppose the other comments I would make is around that reliance on the New Zealand agricultural production census and that data issue around Hamilton. I suppose that sticks out to us because that's a bit of an obvious one. I take on board your comment that you feel confident in the in that data set at a regional level. We are obviously reporting it at a territorial level, and while the anomaly for Hamilton may be obvious for me or for us, it does make me wonder: are there other somewhat more minor anomalies that present to the other TAs that we just go, oh, that doesn't stick out so much, and so we don't take notice to it? I think that anytime we use data sets to inform either our policy direction or messaging to our community, it is really imperative that it is very sound, and the way we're choosing to engage with it is defendable. And I suppose that as someone who's involved in the agricultural sector, I would wonder if this is the best source for reliable information. I do note your point that you're hoping that with freshwater farm plans, there will be more reliable data. And I think that that would be useful going forward. I'm just wanting to pick up on what Ben, sorry, Councillor Dunbar Smith was raising around the cost. I see, you know, I note your recommendation to include the organic soils based on the case study. I understand the case study was done in-house, but what about if it's going to be included in an ongoing setting? How is that being funded? Reason I raise this is that we end up with recommendations that on surface at this level we go, yes, that seems absolutely a reasonable way forward, but we're not necessarily taking into account that all of those things add up. So just wanting to clarify for myself that we know or don't know that if we gave effect to that recommendation that it would, that the costs are accounted for somewhere, or that there's a request coming through somewhere?
Yes, through the chair. So the inclusion of emissions from organic soils in the next inventory. So that work would then be, you know, become part of the task of collating the inventory. Although if that data is generated from our in-house calculations and study technical report, then I wouldn't foresee a significant increase in the cost of undertaking the inventory because of that. Although I think we need to recognise that for the next inventory, as Alice noted, there will need to be a recalculation of previous inventory periods for a couple of reasons. One is the shift to AR6, and also included in there would be taking account of the greenhouse gas emissions from organic soils. So to enable that comparison through time, bring that through into the inventory periods as well. So yeah, together for the next inventory, I imagine, yeah, overall more work would be required.
Hayden, I'll just get Karen to comment as well.
Thank you, Chair. As Hayden and Alice pointed out, the next steps really are about a review of this process, and that will be quite a comprehensive look at it because we have a lot of questions we want to answer ourselves. We're also really interested in having a conversation with our districts, which are looking to use this information in far more detailed and nuanced way than previously, as we are becoming more practiced in the climate change response. So we do want to pause, take a stock take. Where are we at? What are we going to do with this? And the recommendations might or might not be picked up in our work plan that we'll be bringing back to councillors. And I think the important thing to note is we're just asking you to receive this report and the information in it today.
And I understand that, Karen, and thanks for providing that detail. I suppose I am just raising it because, you know, we have already embarked on some of our initial discussions for ahead of our LTP process, and there has been strong concern from this council around cost of living, around rate rises, ensuring that the work that we're doing is efficient and effective and meeting the needs of our ratepayers in an affordable manner. And so while we do things in-house, we also recognize that if we're doing an additional thing in a house, then either there was capacity there that wasn't being utilized, which isn't efficient, or we're doing that instead of something else. And I just want to make sure that we're cognizant of both of those factors and making really conscious decisions around them. I suppose the only other thing that I would raise would be that if we are going to incorporate the organic soils, and particularly given that that case study was centered around the Karakia area, we do have, or well, very shortly, we will have a subcommittee of Integrated Catchment Management Committee that incorporates that area. I think that that would be a useful discussion point for that that group of people to provide, to enable them to provide further insight and feedback around how we might address this going forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Totally agree. And with the point previous, because the signal I want to send on, I love the fact that it's being reviewed, and I think we're at a point where the district and city council need to take more of an ownership role of the journey to get more bottom-up data, because a lot of the national stuff and the Stats New Zealand stuff is a lot of top-down, and we're saying with this regional work that we've done, to do this well, you need a lot of bottom-up, and in the meantime, our community has gotten to a point where a lot of large players or large emitters have got data, and as I understand, it is just that there's concerns around confidentiality and such, which can be managed. So as part of that, I would hope there would be an intermediate, independent type of entity that would help facilitate some MOUs to allow data to be sourced and aggregated and shared with researchers to be analysed, but then safe for those organisations, because this whole thing about chasing data is going to waste a lot of time for whoever's doing the work, but it is time for the districts to step up a bit and own it in that relationship. But I'm grateful that we've taken them to the point where we have with this. I'm going to pass on to Mike. Thank you for waiting so patiently.
Just about forgotten my questions now. Morning. How come Rotorua Airport's not included?
So Rotorua makes up quite a small area of, so we decided to expand. Yeah.
And isn't it? Rotorua and Taupo are both. Right, and the airport's not?
No. The town or the
okay, reason. The second question is in energy. How come like especially geothermal and solar or turbines isn't included like forestry, and because they're looking at geothermal could take up 30% of New Zealand's power. So why isn't that a negative for us in our region included in your data?
I might get Ross or Chair Saylor to take that one.
Sorry, Alice, who did you say?
Ross or Chair Saylor, are you able to answer that one?
Yes, it's Chair Saylor here. So in terms of the energy, the way that GPC methodology works is that we're looking at stationary energy sources of emissions. That means that we are covering sources like electricity production, electricity use, natural gas use, LPG, diesel, and so on. So the entire approach to accounting is not necessarily with a view of what are those renewable sources of energy within the boundary of the inventory, but rather what are the activities that lead to emissions generation. So, for example, if we have extensive or greater renewable sources of energy within a region that is subject to the inventory, it means that maybe we have much less use of natural gas within that region as a result. And that's reflected in terms of how we calculate emissions, because then the volumes of activity data for natural gas or LPG or diesel use and so on will reduce as a consequence of that. So currently, I would say that to the extent that any of the renewable energy sources you mentioned in the region are reflected in the volumes of fuel that is used for stationary energy, and we are accounting for those emissions. In other words, if it wasn't for some of these sources, the emissions would be even higher in the region potentially.
Thanks, Mike. Tipper.
Push something. Okay, good to go. No, just thinking for the last two contributions by the committee, probably the value to the ratepayers is a climate commons, somewhere where they go to where all this data is collected in a more accessible way. So again, if we're going to have a passive outcome from this, is that our ratepayers can go onto our sites and access reports that they can readily. So just asking for that layer to be considered, because it's one thing for the elected members knowing or current decision makers, but we're trying to educate the public of the future.
Yes.
So I think that's probably the value add. Going to do this work, then we've got to put it into a for the public in a way they can access it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Completely agree. Stu?
And in a way where all the information is there, not just part of it. That's.
I had another question, and that was just I'm mindful that with Cyclone Gabrielle and such, we had large losses of forestry being flattened by the cyclone. Elsewhere, there have been wildfires. We talk about getting our data from harvest, but is there sequestration lost that we're not accounting for? Do you have any comment on that, maybe Sarah Saylor or Ross?
Just as Chair Sela here, indeed, this is a very good point. And another time when this study recommendation was discussed, I, in fact, was thinking to jump into the conversation. The idea of a forestry study is really not just with a view of harvest volumes. For some of you that may have recalled the initial inventory report that we prepared 6 years ago, at the time we looked at and explained a bit more extensively in the report the impact that forestry planting and harvest cycles have on emissions inventory. So when we are talking about a better, more granular, if you want, or robust understanding of forestry within the region, is with a view to both the rates of harvesting, which we know they are changing, but as important is also the ability of replanting and how we manage land more broadly. I was just in Hawke's Bay last week, and they estimated that riparian planting and some small afforestation that was done with a view to increasing riparian and water outcomes as well. And they estimate that about 45 million worth of riparian planting has been lost as a result of the cyclone. This has an impact, obviously, not just on the economics, but also on emissions reduction when we talk about small plots of forest, for example. And we need to think much more holistically than simply emissions. There will be implications, I would say, and where we're going to see those implications is, in terms of inventory, is around the sequestration rates going down. And as you know, this year, the reason why the net emissions for the region are much higher, or let's say higher than expected, is simply because it's not just the harvest cycle, but it's also because for a while, a few years back in Waikato, we have not replanted at a rate high enough to even compensate for the harvest that was happening at the time. And now we see the consequences of that, and that will continue for a number of years longer as part of this cyclical nature, if you want, of trees growing. So all of that together does suggest this idea of actually getting a bit more of a granular understanding so that we really can even estimate, what is the potential of sequestration going forward. And data shouldn't be that difficult to get by if, different sectors, land use, land cover, forestry, work together to get this information in place.
Thank you for that. And yeah, it highlights to me definitely why it's so important to have a focus on gross emissions as a target as well, which I understand the Climate Commission is advising government through that draft second emissions budget feedback that was asked for recently, because it's just so vulnerable to rely on the net aspect. And so I see why the recommendation came up about the forestry study. It's great to see a reduction in gross emissions over time, but obviously it's not at the pace and scale that we require. That's quite clear, but it is a good direction to be going in. Is there anything that our presenters just wanted to say as a last comment? Or Karen?
Thank you, Chair. Just one point of clarification. So there were 2 case studies undertaken as part of the wider project. One estimated the greenhouse gas emissions from organic soils, and that was undertaken for the entire region, whereas the case study around the draft Hauraki FMU, obviously looking at sequestration options specifically for that area.
And online?
Perhaps Perhaps just a bit of a closing note. When we look at the results of the emissions inventory for the region and compare with the trends at national level, it's been really wonderful to see that there's been reduction since the previous inventory. So for the last 3 years, for example, agriculture emissions have been reduced by about 5%. We now know in terms of national trends that that's been a bit slower for the last 2 inventories and so on. So this, these are aspects and trends that need to be celebrated in some ways because it shows there is a move in the right direction. And it's a matter of, the ability to keep the trend going and also our ability to measure emissions properly so that it informs this type of analysis. But overall, for us, having done this now 3 times and having the ability finally to look a little bit at the trends, and I would stress that they are indicative, right? So just 3 inventories is not always easy to say, well, this is a definite trend, particularly as we've observed also volatility for a sector like transport, for example. But overall, it is a trend in the right direction. And although Waikato region starts from a very high emissions for agriculture, for example, we can see that is reducing through, changes in land use and management changes and so on. And that's all to be, to be acknowledged, I believe.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all our presenters. Nothing else. We'll move to receive the report. Happy to second. And then all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. That was, always find that report really interesting. Thank you to all of you. Then the next item. Let's see, what have we got next? We've got an energy update and then the local climate risk assessment. Would anybody like a 5-minute break? Or shall we be quick? All right, we'll carry on then. And right, then I'll invite up Blair Dickey for the renewable energy update. Kia ora, Blair.
Kia ora. Given the discussion and the weighting of the previous items, this is quite light in comparison.
Yes.
And it's just an update for information on energy matters and where things are going. I'd like to highlight 3 things. Firstly, updates in relation to offshore wind. Secondly, what's happening nationally with MBIE's activities. And thirdly, the regional response to that in relation to your discussions over strategic priorities and the like. Next slide, please. There's been quite a bit of interest in offshore wind. Certainly, we're told the resource is there. However, the soft infrastructure, the regulations aren't, but companies are eyeing up the area offshore of the west coast of the region as part of the national effort to decarbonise the economy. We've had 2 meetings. One was a public semi-public meeting organised by Te Waka in relation to Blue Float and environmental groups joint venture. And that occurred at the Don Rowland Centre. Their effort was to look at what are the supply chain implications of an offshore wind industry. So it was certainly things like construction, what ports they were looking at, operations and maintenance, and flow-on sort of support for that, for those sorts of activities. So they were quite, and they also gave us a bit of an update on what their thinking was to date. When they launched their project in December, might have been November, December last year, they were looking very much at a small phase 1 and then a much larger phase 2. Well, they've actually updated and upsized their phase 1 thinking to an increase from about 215 to 810 megawatts, and a phase 2 floating arrays, is keeping that at just over 1,000 megawatts. The implications for the region here is that the integration of infrastructure is a regional role, and particularly even though this particular joint venture is citing their interest in the EEZ, where there's currently a policy vacuum that MB are working on, that still relates to the council's responsibility with respect to transitioning the transmission across the coastal marine area. And obviously, because they were looking at a supply chain event, they were focusing on employment, not just in the construction and operation, but also what this could lead to in the future. Second meeting was just recently, and that was between another joint venture, CIP and the New Zealand Super Fund, who up until now have been quite public about their interest in the South Taranaki area. And they're also looking at what is available offshore and seeing constraints with respect to transmission in the Taranaki area, although the resource, they say, is really wonderful down there, and the expertise, but there is transmission constraints where that's not as pressing in the Upper North Island, particularly as Transpower's grid is particularly strong between Taupo and Auckland, and of course Auckland is a large load. Their meeting occurred just earlier this month, and it was a briefing for Chairman Story and Chairwoman Story and the CEO, and it was an introduction as to what their interests were with that resource. It's a bit different in that they were looking at up to 1,000 megawatts inside the coastal marine area. So that is inside the area that is covered by the Regional Coastal Plan, and a second phase of about the same, up to 1,000 megawatts way offshore. So in that respect, the two areas that these two joint ventures have indicated do not intersect, but we don't know where they're actually going to land. Both parties were briefed on the opportunity that exists now with the submissions phase of the Regional Coastal Plan being open. I mean, this is an ideal opportunity for them to actually put in front of commissioners or decision makers just the type of policies that are needed for this sort of activity, and so that can be weighed up. They're also interested in what happens not just in the construction and maintenance, but to the region in the employment and low emissions economy. And that goes to the strategic direction for a transition to the low emissions economy. Second area, change the slide, thanks, William. The second area was a hui that was held here in this room actually by MB, looking at what's happening nationally. And This is the New Zealand Energy Strategy. It builds upon 6 other pieces of work that are currently being done by MB, and that includes the offshore renewable energy, linking back to the previous matters. When I mentioned a policy vacuum, MB is in the process of working out how it can put some interim regulations in place so that companies, joint ventures can have security of location so they can actually spend money and work out what the implications of their projects are. So that's going to be depending. And this council made submissions on that earlier on this year. Other matters that the New Zealand Energy Strategy will build on are the gas transition plan, the hydrogen roadmap, the electricity market measures, the New Zealand battery project, and what you've already commented on is the National Policy Statement on renewable electricity, the emissions, the environmental standard, and on transmission. That's already been commented on. So those are those 6 precursor bits of information and work that will inform the strategy. The strategy has 4 objectives. Energy to be affordable, fast, secure in the face of climate change, and not dampen the economy. The economy still runs, and I can go through those objectives, but that is in a nutshell what those 4 are. And we can expect a discussion paper at the end of this year with a final energy strategy at the end of next year, maybe into 2025. Just want to highlight that the hui that was held here had 18 invitees from various parties and interests, and some in this room too. And certainly I didn't have the foresight, as Pamela did, to take pictures of the whiteboard, the the outputs, but from my recollection of the working group that I attended, was certainly recognised the strong regional role, both for inter and intra regional integration. That's with territorial councils and also with adjoining regions and transmission implications with our RMA functions. And that includes on the supply side, particularly land use, because a lot of although we've got a mature hydro and geothermal, although there's room for work in that area, a lot of the opportunities going forward are going to be based on land use, whether that's land use in the marine environment or terrestrial land use. It means working with territorial councils for solar, wind, biomass, and also for transmission. And again, also on the demand side, there's a regional role with integrating with district councils on urban form. That's the amount of, like, for instance, making it efficient so you don't have to use as many VKT, vehicle kilometres travelled, and also substitution of fuels, both industrially and for portable transport fuel. So what are we doing about it? Next slide, please. You have already had the foresight to include in your strategic directions the need to transition to a low emissions economy, but also to body the organisation with the role of producing a energy inventory so that we can have a informed input into the national energy strategy I was talking about before, but also a review of the regional energy strategy. And that slide there is CE transferring your wishes to staff in the form of his KPIs, and certainly took notice of that one. And with us today, we've got, I'd just like to introduce Katrina Andrews, who's going to be the project manager on that inventory, working on that one. And initially, determined yet is stock take of what is, and look at opportunities of what could be, who's involved, and also, again, that important part of land use implications that has spatial implications there. And if you want any more information on that, certainly we've tried to be a bit more informative in the paper, paragraph 30. And just to note that it's a fairly quick piece of work. It's required by first quarter next year. So it'll be a desktop exercise.
Thank you, Blair.
Happy
Any
to answer any further questions.
questions or comments for Blair? Thank you. Ben, go for it.
I just wanted to say, having sat in on the national energy strategy people here, I think it's a good idea to do a regional energy inventory. Question was, is it something we can do largely in-house, given it's an inventory? And secondly, if there are costs, is it something the TAs would contribute to?
I can't foresee any costs other than meeting expenses, and definitely it's a desktop in-house, contacting those that have the information, asking them if they're happy to share that information, so that we can do it. So,
Great. Anyone else? Right. My main piece of feedback would be that on the list you have in paragraph 30 of the things that the regional energy inventory is likely to include, I would really like to include one more, and that would be existing and potential future community energy generation and transmission infrastructure. The way it reads currently, it seems it's all focused on large scale grid only. So things that big business and government is into. And I think there is a place where our communities, certain communities scattered around the region, who are interested in more resilience through generation close to home and their own setups, I suppose, whether that be using their own land or public land through the councils.
certainly, I take that on board, and it has urban as well as rural implications, particularly with biogas.
Thank you. And no, very last comment would be just on the national energy strategy. The 4 objectives that they mention, the focus areas. C asks for a transition that supports economic development and productivity growth. And D, transitions at a scale and pace to support net zero greenhouse gases by 2050. I'd call it, it's an ambitious thing to be aiming for, because my understanding is that there's no country in the world yet that's managed to decouple emissions from their GDP. And if they have, it's only been very temporary, or it's been because they've outsourced some of it to another country. And so while it is possible to decouple emissions, not yet seen at a scale and pace that's required. So I wish them well to write a really good strategy. That would just be my feedback based on other things I'm into. Tipper.
Just noting that the waste to energy applications throughout our region are live, and I'm not sure what the policy, that it's just not mentioned here, given that there are different proposals being considered in different parts of the district. Is it just something we're not going to look at, or waiting for a national set?
It's probably just me trying to keep the content of the item to manageable and for information, but certainly can pick up on that. Yep.
Yeah, because we had in the climate action roadmap one action point to understand the pros and cons of waste to energy.
It's just that it's a live discussion in one of our TAs. I think if they look for a policy setting, they'd expect we'd have it. So
yeah, I mentioned before, Councillor, about the opportunities for biogas from rural farming operations. Well, that's a waste and to an energy thing. So yes, in scope, but not in the paper. I'm sorry.
And then my last one on coal, because it's still being used in the region for electricity gen, and not just for their plant burn coal as part of their consent. So I know it was picked up in the last report, but is it an energy source that we're looking at, I guess, sinking the lid on or closing the mine on?
Definitely the idea is to transition from a fossil fuel sources to renewable energy sources, and biomass is the option there, biogas as well. So it's definitely in scope.
Thank you.
Thanks. Pamela?
I suppose my only comment, though, would be recognizing that security of supply is paramount to well-functioning communities. So that needs to be considered alongside that transition.
Absolutely. It's wish them well writing their strategy and then us writing ours. Thank you, Blair. Would someone like to move Tipper and Stu second? All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thanks everyone for that one. Then we have one last item, and that's the update on the Waikato Regional Climate Change Risk Assessment. That will have Lisa Armstrong come up and Karen Bennett present also.
No, I'm going to ask Lisa to present this because Lisa has felt the pain all the way through this project. Members might be aware that we initiated this project last year and completed phase 1 by our project timeline. And then phase 2 became somewhat impeded by the effects of the climate when we lost a number of staff to the various cyclone responses, both our own staff, but also those in territorial authorities and other stakeholder groups. So now we've regrouped and reset the project, and we're now on track to get it completed. And Lisa's here just to outline the steps we're going to take. Thank you, Lisa.
Kia ora koutou. First of all, I'll just start by, the purpose of this item is to update, as Karen said, and on the progress and the planned approach to complete our regional climate change risk assessment. So just to go back, I guess, to the starting point as to why we're doing this piece of work, we're wanting to better understand the specific climate change risks for the Waikato, and to do that, we're bringing together this comprehensive climate change risk assessment for the region. So it'll help bring together our collective understanding of climate risk across all aspects of our environment, our people, our property and our economy. It will support our adaptation planning and prioritisation of work programs. And I'd like to emphasise that this is in the broadest sense possible, not because I know there's a lot of discussion around managed retreat and community funding. So this risk assessment is looking more broadly than simply the issues associated with managed retreat, although this work is very much complementary and will fit in with that. And so, for example, we're looking at a range of hazards, so flooding and land instability as a result of extreme rainfall through to heat waves, drought and fire risk from extended and water impacts on water availability from extended periods without rain and increasing temperatures. So it's a broad look at climate risk across the region. And how will we use it? In part, it's also to extend the climate risk knowledge and understanding across our region in terms of our community understanding and that of our stakeholders, to collate key risk information, develop that shared understanding, identifying critical information gaps as well, and where we can, providing a geospatial representation of that work. So as you'll be aware, we commenced the first phase of this work back in the first half of 2022 when we carried out a high-level risk screening process. So we held surveys and workshops with that and identified a large number of climate change risks. And so the next step is to carry out that detailed assessment, which involves shortlisting and rating the risks to our region across a range of timeframes and different climate change scenarios. As Karen mentioned, we paused that work due to the weather events, and we've really kicked off that work again, because managing the tail of events like that has quite an impact on both business as usual and in particular projects. So we're planning to complete the detailed risk assessment by the 30th of June 2024. The coastal marine risk assessment in respect of ecosystems and species has been completed, and that's been a really useful piece of work to help, refine our methodology. As part of the next stage of this risk assessment work, we're also carrying out a geospatial exposure assessment. And so you'll see in the report the planned timeframe for that to identify key elements and key hazards that we will identify, ascertain the data that's available, and then develop the mapping for that. And so the timeframe for that is set out in more detail in the report, but is planned to be completed by the 1st of May 2024. In terms of the reporting, so everything by the 30th of June, and we will be, using and sharing the information as we complete, the risk assessment for different topics over the coming months, and, embedding those and using them where appropriate in our work. And as we progress through the risk assessment, we're going to be thinking more about exactly how we report and present the risk information. Other councils have taken any number of approaches. So some have very, volumes and volumes of reports. Others have just simply used the base spreadsheet to present that information. And so as we work through the risk assessment process, we're going to be thinking carefully about how we report that information. And I tautoko Councillor Mahuta's comment around the making information accessible to our communities, and that will be one of the key drivers in front of mind for the risk assessment work in terms of how we present it and report it going forward. As I mentioned, we're going to take a modular approach so that we can adjust as we go, because at the same time as we're completing this work, there's substantial central government work programs underway, and of course the very focused local adaptation planning inquiry that touches on risk assessment, but as I said, that's at a local scale, not this higher regional scale. And then, for example, at the moment, we're also responding as part of how we develop the risk assessment and present it. We're also conscious of the central government work programs, and for example, about in terms of climate risk information that's being shared at a national level, and climate data and tools that are coming out of central government. We're cognizant of all of those as we progress through this project. So I think it's called Agile Project methodology. So
Thanks.
anyway, yeah, any questions?
Yeah, no, that's great. And comes to mind that if the coastal and marine section has been done in detail at the moment, where are the places where we could start utilising that? And the things that came to mind for me was, because I'm mindful that there was quite a section in there on, wanting to have more iwi engagement to keep fleshing this out further. I think we've got a piece of work happening for developing a West Coast Harbour management plan. It'd be great to see it feed into that. And then also, since I'm the alternate member on the Hauraki Golf Forum, I think there is something that was able to be presented to the Hauraki Golf Forum that would be a great way to get more feedback as well. Project. That's my initial feedback. Anyone else? Stu.
No, just other than I think it's going to be a really useful piece of information, for support of you.
I just state approaches around the country have been different when it comes to some have given it out to people to provide their case study back at a later stage in the project, after so I look forward to that, because we do really have midwives who are looking at their relocation strategies and those stories that are told in our region. Everybody thinks it's happening on an island somewhere else, but if I take Waikato, where my marae is, there's 9 of us to the port that are river adjacent. So we're all planning that way. There's coastal marae that are already there. And so, but that's a layer after this, I think. Look forward to it.
Thank you.
And also, I would be interested to know at what stage this project might be ready to profile, say, in front of them, sharing wider with the district councils at that level, at that governance level. Any thoughts on that? I'm mindful that the risks and the impacts on our communities is something that would be really them.
Through you, Chair. Yes, we have taken this work to the Chief Executive's Forum, then informs the Mayoral Forum, but we haven't taken phase 2 back, which we certainly can do. Get ourselves invited to do so.
Emma.
Yeah, just a question. Thank you for your report. Just a question around the inquiry into community-led retreat and adaptation funding. Are we, I note that staff will consider the issues and options raised and monitor the progress of the inquiry. Are we as a council feeding into that? Just wanting to make sure that we're having that conversation around funding, as Councillor Mahuta has raised. There are already communities within this Rohi that are considering their options. I want to make sure that we as a council have had opportunity to discuss what our views might be and ensure that those views are reflected into the inquiry.
Would you like to answer that, Karen, or is that, I'm happy to. Okay, well, as you'll know, that there's the regional adaptation workshop tomorrow, so I think you're part of the discussion that will be able to provide an opportunity to discuss that, and council is obviously planning to make a submission on that very key piece of
I think it is very key.
Yeah, legislation for us, and it addresses many of the issues that are raised in the memo that was circulated to councillors in preparation for the workshop tomorrow.
Sure, I think it's important that we raise all councillors' awareness that is a critical issue that we all need to feed into really effectively. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, a whole lot of things got released really rapidly recently. So I think there's a few of them that sound really important that we need to prepare a submission on. Right. That looks like us. Thank you for that, Lisa. And thank you for the work. I picked up recently while reading about some of the events happening overseas that while the hazards were well understood and things are happening, I suppose, in line with projections that have been made over the past 3 decades, it's the impacts on people that seem to have been underestimated. And so work like this hopefully get us up to speed as well as possible to prepare our communities. Yeah, sure, Stu, jump in.
I'm assuming what sort of level will this get down to? As in, individual roads in different places that have, I mean, I can think of a couple out by Karakia there that are marginal now, will this sort of identify those or be a little bit broader than that?
It'll probably be broader, and it will also vary depending on the type of risk that we're looking at, because depending on whether is the risk meaningful when we look at it at a regional scale, or do we need to look at it at a district scale, or in the example of specific roads, that's quite a very localized.
But this will feed into the district scale sort of.
Well, it'll be at a high level, and they'll be complementary. And so, for example, I know that there's a number of district councils that are looking at doing their risk assessment at a district scale, and so we'll be working, and talking to those councils to make sure that our work is complementary and
built upon.
Yeah, exactly. So it's almost a bit like a mosaic. So there'll be the top-down information coming, and then the more detailed information coming up, and it's all building this better regional, picture of what climate risk is and the impacts on our region.
Great, thanks. Well, if I move to receive, Pamela, happy to second. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, committee members, for working through the agenda with us. I might Karen, any last thoughts before I close our karakia? Thank you. Okay. Then do our Karakia Whakamutunga. Unahia, unahia, unahia mai te uru tapu nui, kia wātea, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te hinenaro. I te ara takatū, koia rā e rongo, e whakaaria ake ki runga, kia tina, teina, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Thank you, everyone. Just noting we're closing the meeting at 11:29. Thanks all.